Beal for everything they did to bring this event together. My name is Chris Mustafa. I am the Associate Director of PennSound. I'm finishing up my PhD in the English department, and I'm Director of IT for all of the academic departments here in the School of Arts and Sciences. I first came to Penn in 2003 to help Al Filreis and Charles Bernstein with an idea that they had, to make a collection of sound recordings of poets reading their own work. I worked on the technological facets of the project way before I had even dreamed of doing a PhD in English, setting up the server, designing the digitization workflows, getting all the media gear that we needed to digitize records and other formats. That project, which started primarily from Charles Bernstein's audio cassette collection, is now the world's largest archive of recordings of poets reading their own work and is over 15 years old. PennSound is accessed more than 2 million times per year by 1 million unique visitors from the vast majority of the world's countries, and it contains nearly 60,000 recordings of poets reading their own work and 6,000 hours of audio. The idea for this panel, which is dedicated to the groundbreaking research built upon the Poetry Audio Archive, first came when Charles and I gave the keynote address at a conference dedicated to Poetry Audio Archives at the Sorbonne. And I would just say, like, it's a pretty amazing thing to have an entire conference dedicated to poetry audio, given the continued focus, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit about this, on the primacy of the visual text of poems. And so this was a big deal to even have a conference like that. And during the Q&A, a great scholar of German poetry, our friend Professor Dr. Reinhard Meyer-Kalkus, raised his hand and he asked us a question. And he said, "The value of such an archive seems evident to me, but I have to ask you, where's the scholarship built on all of your work? Where are the dissertations, the edited collections, the monographs?" And of course, there were at the time works that took poetry audio seriously beyond work written by scholars affiliated with PennSound. But there was a question of visibility, and I mean that in multiple senses of the word. I mean that in the sense of the primacy given to the printed visual form of poetry, and in the sense that work on poetry audio needs to be more prominently featured and discussed. And this panel is in a way a response to Reinhardt's question, though 2 years after he asked it, but I like to think about things before I answer. It highlights the crucial contributions to our understandings of poetry via sound, work that could not be done without the preservation and dissemination, and that's crucial, of recordings of poets, work that builds on the archive. So when you hear about Lytle's Narrowcast, Jason's Phonopoetics, and excerpts from Orchid's dissertation, these are works that will resituate our understandings of poetic literary history around sound. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Lytle Shaw is a founding contributing editor of Cabinet Magazine and professor of English at New York University. His books include Frank O'Hara, The Poetics of Coterie, the Moiré Effect, Fieldworks from Place to Site in Postwar Poetics, and Narrowcast, Poetry and Audio Research. Jason Camelot's most recent article. Sorry. I should say we'll have copies of a number of the works we're discussing today and others for sale at cost today. So I hope you guys will consider picking up a copy. And I'm sure that Jason and Lytle and Orchid would be happy to inscribe your copy for you after the event. Jason Camelot's most recent articles are on Curating the Signal, forthcoming in Jacket 2. Robert Creeley's poetry readings in English Studies in Canada, and William Morris's ideas about education in socialist studies. His recent books, Phonopoetics, The Making of Early Literary Recordings, and the co-edited collection with Catherine McLeon, Candlit Across Media, on archiving the literary event, will be out in spring 2019 with Stanford University Press and McGill Queen's University Press, respectively. He's also the author of 4 collections of poetry, The Animal Library, Attention All Typewriters, The Debaucher, and What the World Said. He is professor of English and associate dean in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Concordia University in Montreal, and the director of the Spoken Web Research Partnership funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which can be reached at spokenweb.ca. Orchid Tierney is from Aotearoa, New Zealand, currently residing in Philadelphia. Her chapbooks include Brachiation, The World in Small Parts, Gallipoli Diaries, Blue Doors, and Ocean Plastic. She is the author of a full-length sound translation of the Book of Marjorie Kemp. Her collection, A Year of Misreading the Wildcats, is forthcoming from the operating system. She is the Andrew W. Mellon Digital Humanities Price Lab Fellow this year. So, and we'll turn it over to Lytle to get started.
Do I need to talk into the mic?
Yes.
This is being recorded.
For preservational. Okay. All right then. So I want to talk just a little bit about the genesis and process of composing Narrowcast. And really what I want to say about it, I guess, is that there had been quite a bit of work that uses PennSound in a kind of quasi-documentary way. And I thought that now with the kind of massive proliferation of the materials on the site, that it would be worth doing something a little bit different and thinking more broadly about the ways that access to audio archives changed the kinds of arguments we could make about poetry, and really to consider a series of case studies in a bit more depth rather than in a broader kind of way. And so I tried to think about cases in which appeal to a particular recording and a close reading of a recording could change what we could fundamentally say about a particular poet. That was a sort of test case or threshold. But the other kind of underlying problem was that nobody can agree on even how we describe audio recordings. So it was of interest to me that the questions of description that are really just basic to, they're basic to literary criticism too, but there may be more, so they're not different in kind when we deal with audio criticism, with audio files. But they're maybe different in degree and they're more vivid because nobody agrees on how you would describe a recording. So I became very interested in that too. And what I was asking myself in a way was not so much what the recordings mean, but in a sense where they met, like what kind of context you could build around them, and what their status as evidence was. And the case studies are on Ginsberg's 1966 reel-to-reel tape that he made after he was given $500 by Bob Dylan and drove across the country to record the sounds that would eventually become The Fall of America. And I was interested in that project for a couple of reasons. One of them was that Ginsberg he undertook this field work in a way to think about radio's production of national subjects that were in favor of the Vietnam War at that moment. And so he wanted to kind of do a negative ethnographic project of testing out the different micro environments of radio programming that were in effect producing the support. And it seemed to me that the reel-to-reel actually registered that project in a more direct way than his textual manifestation ever could, because you actually got the radio environments. And so my fundamental question was, well, why did he turn it into print again? And I think that the answer that I've come up with is that he saw or noticed the voice relativizing effects of recording. And he ran away in horror from them, that you couldn't, sort of be a logos to the same degree that he wanted to be, and also deal with car noise and background jingles and things like that. And whereas to my ears, that was the conceptually most interesting part of his project, actually, was the overlapping between his voice signals and the environments that produced them. And it seemed to be very much in line with what he was doing. And unlike a lot of other poets, Ginsberg had the means and the connections to release this as an audio record at that moment, had he wanted to, but he chose not to. I'm going to come back to Ginsberg in a second, but the other case studies, there's one on Aigner, there's one on Olson, and there's one on Baraka in relation to the emergence of Canadian sound studies and the kind of crazy, quasi-fictive, not fictional, but like it sounds like a narrative, actually, dimension of that is that I discovered that in Glenn Gould's trips across the Canadian landscape, in The Search for Petula Clark and The Idea of North, he was essentially mapping American infrastructure positions in which anti-missile radar systems had been established by the U.S. government, one at the Canadian border, one about halfway up, and then one the dew line all the way at the close to the edge of habitable land in Canada. And that whole dimension of the American infrastructure in the Canadian space was really tamped down in these documentaries, partly because they were designed to celebrate the Canadian centennial in 1967. And so that was a sort of awkward social imperial fact that they didn't want to deal with. But when I discovered that one of the people that would have been mobilized had a Soviet plane come over the North Pole and these systems gone into effect was Amiri Baraka, then that became the kind of hinge point for this, and I began to think about his training in the Air Force in relation to this infrastructure. So that's the final chapter, but I won't say more about it now. The more unexpected part, the other unexpected part of the process of writing this was that as I was reading in what I was calling kind of the social life of tape recording in the 1960s, that's what I was trying to think about, was what were some of the social functions that tape recording had, and what was its status as evidence. I became interested in the fact that these same poets were being surveilled by the same, using the same technologies by the state, by the FBI and the CIA, quite a bit, especially Ginsberg and especially Baraka. And Baraka had people, sneaking into his readings and recording them and then pouring over them in a kind of close reading way afterwards. And at first I just thought, oh, this is going to be a distraction, the ham-fisted state, not really knowing what to make of all this difficult experimental poetry. But the more I read, the more I realized that wasn't the case at all, actually, that especially the CIA tended to have as its literary operatives people who had gone to Yale and studied with new critics. And they were extremely sophisticated, if mean and wrong, in the way that they were reading. And so part of the project then became to take on this seriously and take seriously the ways in which what CIA listeners were doing was a form of research that was not unlike that the poets were going on to do, or that I was doing, and that they had to have hypotheses in advance. They had to have approved thesis topics from their dissertation advisor, J. Edgar Hoover, if you were in the FBI, or Angleton in the CIA. And so I began to think more about the kinds of interpretive paradigms that they labored under and how that related to the research that they did. Because as you probably know, many of them still believed at this point that there was really only one enemy at this point, and that the enemy was the Soviet Union, and the New Left was by and large a kind of epiphenomenon that was a paper tiger in a sense, because it was really led by Soviet agents that were pretending to be non-communist but were in fact communist. And so anti-racist movements, ecological movements, feminist movements, anti-war movements were all at some level kind of mystifications of the real movement, which was a Soviet, pro-Soviet movement. And at first, this seemed just completely self-evidently ridiculous. We know about the reality that drove the New Left, but I became interested in the way that actually it bore a kind of bizarre structural similarity to Jameson's reading of the New Left, in the sense that Jameson also would say that while he's of course sympathetic to these other movements, the kind of pluralism of multiple interpretive causes is not just a kind of potential distraction from the final analysis, the ultimate horizon, as he would say, but is actually kind of finally directly in the way of the kind of ultimate horizon of class analysis that he projects. So I began to think about Angleton in relation to, who is the director of counterintelligence at the CIA, in relation to Jameson, and to put them into dialogue. And I discovered also that Henry Kissinger's another key figure in here. His French tutor at Harvard was Paul de Man. And so we traced that out, and I get to imagine the kinds of French sentences that de Man launches to Henry Kissinger, and then Kissinger repeats back to him. So I'm going to turn over the floor, but I'm happy to answer any kind of questions about the book.
Great. So are slides visible, I guess, is my first question?
Not yet.
No. And I guess my second question is, should I use VGA if we're doing the sound through a separate wire? Because the HDMI might try to grab the sound, right?
That shouldn't be an issue.
No?
You can change the output, the audio output. But you can try VGA.
Oh, do you have your VGA dongle?
Oh.
We don't have a VGA cable though, so.
Oh, so.
So maybe if you unplug it.
Okay, let's try it again. No? It's a very, worst case scenario, I can probably play the audio.
Is there something that you can put onto another laptop quickly? Or do we switch order?
you want to try it on yours and see if it works? And I can see it.
Is the source on the right channel?
Yeah. Maybe I'll try to VGA. The problem is,
Well, I could probably just go ahead without the visuals. If you think that would be.
Is the audio working for you?
Yeah, let's see if the audio works in any case. Because I just wanted to play a few sounds. So I've just finished a book. It's also published with Stanford University Press and has a similarly sort of striking cover like that. So I guess they're really developing their sound series. Let's see if I can play. I just want to see if any of these sounds will play. Yeah, looks right. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, I'll pause that. So, my book is called Phonopoetics: The Making of Early Literary Recordings, and it's really kind of a prehistory to all of the, well, not that there's an enormous amount, but to the growing number of works that are being written about modern and contemporary sound poetry archives. So I begin with the earliest recording formats, cylinder recordings. So it starts in the 1890s as far as the actual archive I had access to, but it goes further back than that because part of my argument initially is that really the sound of Victorian recitation and the history of elocution is still audible in some of those early records. So the book kind of opens with discussions of the introduction of the phonograph as a medium and the different kinds of imaginaries that arose around it as a new kind of speaker, right? There were quite a few recordings made in the very early years, most of which were promotional, that were poems written and voiced from the perspective of the phonograph itself. And so I was asking myself, what is the voice of the phonograph, and what did that mean in relation to all of the kinds of materials that one would normally find in Victorian recitation anthologies, most of which consisted of dialect recordings, right? So it sort of becomes a question of what was the continuum of proper speech performance in relation to other kinds of speech performance. Should we try the VGA? From this sort of initial chapter, which thinks about the phonograph as a kind of site for imagining new kinds of voice and voicing, right? I move into talking about and discussing some of these earliest literary recordings, which, as I said, also ranged from the dialectical to what we would identify as high elocutionary. And really, it's a loaded thing if you're starting with recordings in the 1890s to call them literary recordings. It's kind of an anachronistic concept, right? So part of the reason I call this book The Making of Early Literary Recordings is not just about the production of the recordings themselves, but it's about the production of the concept of the literary around these actual artifacts, right? And I'm really spending quite a lot of time thinking about, what was perceived as sort of high versus low in these early kinds of materials. All right, there we go. So that's the cover of the book. That's a gramophone horn on the cover, and I'm really happy with it. It was a friend of mine who took that photo at a museum called the Musée des Ondes de Mille Berliner in Montreal. We spent a lot of time there just looking through. It's like a sound audiophiles' hoarders' paradise, that place, and they had tons of gramophone horns. And I think the gramophone horn is a really appropriate image for this project because it was the conduit of sound, but it's also a kind of material object that affected the actual input and output of sound. Because in acoustic recording, there was no electrical transduction of the sound waves, of the vibrations, air vibrations, into an electrical signal. They were basically through a diaphragm recorded directly onto wax or other materials that they were developing. So acoustic recordings were a particular kind of recording. So this is just an example, as I was saying, of these kinds of articulations of the phonograph speaking for itself. No tongue have I, no hands. So this idea of a kind of disembodied, pure, some kind of different than human voice, but in some sense a voice that actually ascended above all possibilities of human articulation. And then the other side of this would be these virtuosity kinds of records where, and I'm not going to play you the snoring or sneezing records, but basically a lot of the early recordings were showing forms of disarticulation. And so they weren't necessarily avant-garde forms of disarticulation, but they were at the same time performing, in a sense, the range of what the capacity of the medium would be to capture of human speech. So it wasn't just that it could capture semantically discernible speech, but capture, these were often early sales points for the phonograph, is that it can capture any sound, even the sound of laughter, like things like as though somehow it was still a text-based transcoding medium, so that it should only be able to capture, discernible or semantically discernible things. So I moved from talking about these early kinds of recordings into the development of, and this is where I argue the literary recording as a thing really comes into being, which is in the development of pedagogical programs developed by record companies in the first decade of the 20th century around the use of recordings that they made. So often what they're doing is they're taking backlist recordings that were under their recitations or dialect categories that were initially simply marketed and sold as recitations or as comic records, or those would have been the categories under which they would appear in the catalogs, and they're gathering them together and they're starting to develop arguments, and you start to have MAs from major universities in the States writing the introductions to the catalogs, saying that the combination of sound in the presentation, musical sounds and speech recordings in relation to text enhances the experience of the literary work. So it's early ed tech, essentially, but we're getting interesting arguments about the uses of these kinds of recordings, and at the same time, what we have are a lot of interesting examples of attempts to remediate literary works into sound. So I have a whole chapter on remediations of Dickens, right, into sonic form. And basically in the acoustic era, the length of a sound recording was still only between 3 and 4 minutes, right? So you can imagine, like, how would you go about, converting David Copperfield into a 3-minute sound recording, right? It's a kind of question to ask, right? And they had solutions to this, right? And in a way, what they did was they drew upon performers that were already active, Dickens men, as they were called, who would be performing minor characters from Dickens novels, not usually the narrators or the major characters, because they're less interesting. They have, from a sort of dialectical perspective, they don't have the speech tics that we identify, right, with the minor characters. And they would perform sort of monologues that were, in a sense, mashups of all of the speeches they have in a particular novel, right? So they're very condensed sort of encapsulations of Dickens' character. And the arguments for the value of these as literary recordings is that, well, Dickens himself brought characters to life through his genius for dialect. These recordings were even bringing them even more to life by actually having them, speak to you. I'll just play, I think I have a sound recording here. Let's see if it'll work.
Ah, my dear Copperfield, come in, come in. I am rejoiced to see you at this transitory moment. Oh, and my dear legal friend Fredda. Welcome to this humble domicile. Permit me to offer you an article of temporary repose in chalk Recitation.
So that's an early literary recording. It's not what we usually think about as a literary recording nowadays when we're looking at our archives, UbuWeb, even PennSound, et cetera, right? But this is kind of the prehistory to different kinds of recordings. I also spend a lot of time thinking about the relationship between these early recordings and different methods of elocution that were becoming popular and of which there was a proliferation of materials. So this is just a quick sketch of the complexities of some of these schemes, right, that would map out how to actually invoice a particular line or particular poem. They would actually some of them actually use musical notation or equivalents and other kinds of demarcating figures to actually prescribe a vocal performance of particular poems. So some of this is discernible in the recordings, and so I kind of talking, as Lila was saying, about ways of contextualizing these recordings. That's another sort of form of contextualization that I worked on. Oops, sorry. And I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I can wrap up any time. But I just wanted to play one more example of this. I just mashed together a bunch of the Charge of the Light Brigade recordings to give you a sense of some of the elocutionary methods that I look into.
Forward the Light Brigade! Forward for the guns! Into the valley of the Light Brigade! For the guns!
So those are three different elocutionists who I talk about, and then also the emergence of a kind of new form of recording, which was dramatic recitation with orchestral accompaniment. So there was a lot of interest in combining music with literary performance at the time. There were whole repertoires that were developed that often combined musical performances and then recitations, and what's happening in these recordings is, there were examples of live versions of this kind of improvisatory music playing behind actual recitations, but these recordings really bring together the two, and there are a series, they're often narrative recordings. This is another one of the Charge of the Light Brigade, but that it's a quick example of how they would mobilize music to enhance, again, the literary work itself. Let's see if we can get this going. Some of them are not so easy to hear, but yeah, no, it's not reproducing here well here. You can sort of hear the bugles in the background, and kettle drums come in later when the cannons start firing and stuff like that. So it's sort of. And so, a good part of this book is really about the mobilization of sound recording media and technologies into the teaching of literature. And then I move into a final chapter before the conclusion on thinking about the transition from these earlier, what I call sort of Victorian forms of elocution and recitation into most of the stuff that we're really interested in thinking about now, which is like these recordings that were made during the modernist and then 21st century period. And so, what's the link? What happened to this whole tradition of recitation, which was such an important part of teaching? Recitation actually was a form of examination at the end of literary study in the 19th century. And so, your interpretation of a poem you would be examined on. So, interpretation meant literal oral interpretation, right? What happened to that? A short answer in my book, and I'm not the only one who said this, is the new criticism happened to it, right? So it's the 40s in a way where all of these literal conceptions of voice as a performative mode of interpretation, right, comes to be silenced by this abstract concept of the voice in the poem, right, on the page, right? So suddenly you have this more conceptual abstraction that's giving unity to a poem, right, but it's not a literal voice that we're speaking of anymore. So so one might say that there is a bit of a rift, in the tradition, right, which explains to some extent. I do think Yeats and some other poets represent a kind of link, between these periods, right? But my final chapter is on Eliot's experiments in performing The Wasteland, and really I think his early sound recordings that he made. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. To transcription disc in the labs of William Cabell Greed at Barnard College in 1933, which Chris has done a lot of important work on in terms of bringing these up to our attention. Not only these, but a whole bunch of others, and I'll show you on PennSound. You can find a bunch of them. Okay, so these are all from the lab of Greet. What I found fascinating about these transcription discs is that we have multiple takes of Eliot's performances of The Wasteland, and so we get examples of him trying to tune, himself to a performance of that kind of poem, right? How to read The Wasteland was an important question for Eliot, and we might have some answers in that archive to explain his, what I call in the book, his robotic liturgical delivery of much of that poem. If you've ever heard the 1946 Library of Congress recording, but he was experimenting. My main argument about Eliot's experiments is that he was trying to move away from semantically informative delivery, but not to get rid of intonation and all of those things, but to actually find new ways to map them onto the delivery of text. And so I guess I'll close there. This is a quick look at all of the different takes that he made of certain portions of The Wasteland, and maybe I'll just end with one quick clip. This is Robert Speight.
Forgot the cry of gulls, and the deep sea swell, and the profit and loss.
That's what a semantically informed delivery of that line would sound like, and this is what Eliot does to it.
Leave us the Phoenician, a fortnight dead. Forgot the cry of gulls, and the deep sea swell, and the profit and loss.
So he's moving.
Silence out of the dead there, mixing memory and desire.
So he's basically moving away from semantically informed modes of delivery and working on melodic forms. He's working on what I call intonational drift. He's really interested in making intonation not function semantically in the way he delivers the poems, and doing all other kinds of experiments. Yeah. So anyways, those are some of the things that I cover in my book. Yeah. Do you want on the sound as well, right?
No, I think I'm just going to play the sound from...
I just don't want you to spill the Coke. Yeah. Of course. Power.
I knew that was going to happen. Where's my... Here we go.
There you go.
Here's my... I can't see my... Sorry, I'm just trying to find the cursor.
This is a whole new problem at Writer's House.
Yeah.
Here we go. Is it coming up?
Try out and plugging in one more time.
I mean, I can run by just...
All right, great.
Fantastic. Is this thing on?
Yeah, that's well.
Is this thing on? There we go. There we go. Thank you so much. I'm just... I'm really grateful to be here with Ladle and Jason, and it seems to me one of the one of the similar themes that or similar questions that we're asking is actually how do we ask questions about the archive and about sound studies, and I'm sort of like I'm really interested. I want to sort of like I'm interested in my own sort of set of questions, but I thought what I would do is just sort of to begin. The best way to sort of exemplify the kinds of questions and the objects that I'm interested in, I'm going to play just a really short soundbite from Robert Duncan as he's introducing Charles Olson at the Berkeley Poetry Conference on, I think it was July 23rd, 1965. So Zach, can you just play like about 30 seconds?
Put the thing on. What do I need the thing on? Put the thing on. As I think all of you, or almost all of you, must know, the man I'm introducing to tonight is visibly a large man. And he has had to find in poetry.
Yeah, so even before Olson joins the stage, he's already sort of jostling with the audience. We can assume that he's probably fiddling with the microphone, although this exchange, along with his introduction to Olson, isn't actually included in Zoe Brown's transcription of the event that was later published by Quixote Press, and that's the cover of the book. What the microphone does pick up is Duncan's cursory preamble, the audience interjections. Later we can hear other sounds like the toll of the school bell. But what I find really interesting about these kinds of messy sounds is the way that they foreground the reading as a technologized oral event. Duncan's struggle with the microphone further, I think, suggests to me that the device is going to have a mediating presence. And in fact, Olson ends up struggling consistently with the microphone. He describes it as a tether. He can't quite get away from the microphone during this special event. And what I find really interesting about, excuse me, what is this? I'm sort of fiddling here because I can't quite see my notes. What I find really sort of exciting is about this particular area, about this example, is that it sort of illustrates an area in the study of poetry that I'm really sort of excited about, and that's the extraneous asides, the introductions, the preambles, and all the kinds of intrusive sounds that we might hear in a poetry reading. And these sounds, I think, are actually mediating the space of the reading. Now, I actually really hate introductions to poets. I find that they're really boring. And when I'm at a reading, I actually want to hear the poet who's speaking, not the person who's introducing the poet. But when you actually start listening to the unexciting aspects of a poetry reading, you start to sort of pick up some really interesting cultural data about the space of the venue. And by cultural data, I'm suggesting that we can actually learn a lot about reading venues, about environments, about poets' relationships to their technology, such as the microphone, and also to each other as well. And when I started listening to what was essentially unlistenable to me, I realized that there's a whole ambience to poetry events that can highlight everyday life in a particular cultural moment. And some of the questions that I started really starting to ask myself is like, well, what can we learn about these extraneous information? Now, in the PennSound archive, these kinds of peripheral and mundane moments, these mundane sounds are often retained as part of a poetry community's record. And I think that in this regard, our approaches to these peripheral mundane sounds might actually demand a better understanding about where the primary event in the poetry reading and a poetry recording might lie. So the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, that Robert Duncan's introduction isn't included in the transcription in the Quixote Press publication of the Berkeley Poetry Conference, it kind of is really interesting to me because it sort of suggests to me that the publisher has a very clear understanding as to who is the main event of that particular conference. And Yet PennSound sort of retains this sort of introductory moment it retains Duncan's prefatory remarks, and this sort of has led to me to ask a few questions in relationship to my own research and the PennSound archive. And so one of these questions that I've been sort of grappling in my own research and my dissertation is well, how are we supposed to interpret the asides, these prefatory remarks, all these framing materials that exist in the context of the poem and the complete recording of a reading? And this question has some ramifications for me because now I'm sort of thinking in context of archival practice, because now we need to consider, well, what's going to be retained in an archive like PennSound, and what editorial protocols might we need in order to decide what is kept and what is discarded from the archive. So the first part of this question has already, I'm not sort of coming up with anything new here, but I do want to sort of acknowledge that the first part of this question, how are we supposed to interpret these materials, has already been answered in a number of different ways, and I'll signal a couple of them. One of them is Julia Novak's, for example, applies the term paratext in context of the performance of the poem in her book, Live Poetry. And she suggests that our notion of the poem proper, like so when a poet is reciting their poem, this context of like the actual poem ends up breaking down in context, in the context of the performance when we start to attend to extraneous sounds like the people working outside, banging. These kinds of sounds end up becoming part of the authorized performance. And so when we often think about paratext, we're actually more thinking about sort of the print context. We often sort of think about the visual identifiers in books like acknowledgements, page numbers, all these sort of things that kind of end up cueing the reader into spatial identities and spatial positions in a book. But in the context of the audio archive, Novak sort of suggests that the audio text really ends up destabilizing the notion of the poem proper, as these uncontrolled sounds and utterances are themselves paratextual, and they end up legitimating and influencing and shaping the research. And my own research, ends up legitimating the reading, and my own research takes up this idea of the paratext in the audio context and applies it to the supplemental, the contextual, the biographical commentary that similarly upsets the borders of the poem proper. And people like Peter Middleton have already sort of cogently argued about the way that unplanned sound ends up intruding on the spaces of the poetry reading, and he talks about in the context of, you know, the noisy imprints like air conditioners and applause and so forth. And I'm really fascinated by that idea and sort of thinking, well, what do these cultural markers tell us about venue spaces? And I think, and also about the way that audiences themselves end up influencing the recitation of a poem. And I think it's fair to say that the paratext, when we start thinking about the paratext in the audio context, it really advances questions about the nature of performance spaces and audiences, and it also foregrounds the instability of the poetry reading as a contained event. Now, I'm sorry, Al, but I have to sort of say about the notes on paratextuality, because this has been really quite influential about the way that I've sort of thought about these intrusions of extraneous sounds, but also of the introductions. And my research takes up specifically what Al Fouris has called the paraphonotexts. And I just want to do a shout out to this notes on paraphonotextuality, which Al published in Jason Kamlot's and Christian Mitchell's special issue on the reading series in the journal A Modern. And it was really it's such a fantastic issue, and has been very influential in terms of how I sort of think about the reading series and the poetry reading. And Al Fouris sort of suggests that it's not always evident that the prefatory remark is indeed paratextual, and it's not always obvious that the opening of the poem is itself is already underway. So the paratextual remark itself may not signal itself as a precursor or a foreword, but rather the word itself. And I think this is a really interesting idea, because it's very important when we start thinking about poets like Susan Howell is a good example, Rachel Blow Duplessis. You know, when you sometimes listen to their recordings on PennSound, they're often offer framing materials, and then suddenly you sort of realize halfway through, oh, that's actually the poem that they're talking, you know, they're actually reciting. So it's not really clear about where the border between the framing materials and the actual poem, and I find that really fascinating. Paraphonotextuality implies that the sound object isn't a stable entity, and I'm really excited about this idea. So it becomes this question of, well, defining the poem proper and the paratext as self-contained, as self-identical, and as discrete objects may not actually be very helpful. Nor defining them as sort of like discrete objects might not actually help us define what the live conditions of a poetry reading are. So despite that, last year I was the PennSound Price Lab Sound Studies Fellow, and I undertook a research project where I looked at specifically at the prefatory remarks that were contained in a reading series known as the Sex Series. And the Sex Series is a long-running poetry series that takes place on a frequent basis in New York City. And it's a really fascinating long example of a reading series because it's been going since I think the earliest recordings on PennSound are like there are a couple of examples from 1976. It mostly starts from 1978 and goes up to like now, basically. And I looked at from 1978 to January 2018, and I wanted to look at specifically at the paraphonotexts, the introductions in this reading series, just to see what we could actually learn about them. And so this research considered the objects of my inquiry as the paraphonotext as critical and integral cultural data that can illuminate the artificial environments of both the reading series, the reading venue, and the individual reading. So I took Al-Furi's definition of the paraphonotext and applied it to the specific reading series to sort of see what I could learn about what could be illuminated. Now, prefatory remarks, these introductions to poets, are ideological markers. They have a poetics, they have a politics often, they have a meaning. Whether they're pre-scored or improvised, they can actually establish a narrative for the poet before they join the stage, thereby establishing the audience's rapport with the guests. So I just played back the Duncan's really brief introduction, and he's establishing a rapport, but he's giving visual cues to Olson before he even comes onto the stage. So I'm really kind of fascinated about how that sort of enacts a kind of performance in itself. They also allow us to document the historical conditions of the environment. Unprovoked remarks about the weather can give us insight into climate at a particular time, but they can also help situate and localize the reading as these kinds of, as well as providing important history about a poet, as well as their social network and praxis. They can also actually help provide information about the oral history as well about a poet, and a lot of, like particularly in the case of the Sex Series, a lot of, I think the Sex Series is quite unique in the sense that a lot of the people who are introducing the poets are often performing oral scholarship on the poet's work. So you end up asking, what I found I was doing was asking questions about, well, how are we to apprehend this kind of oral scholarship that is being performed in public spaces outside of more traditional academic contexts? So I'm going to sort of wrap up. Hopefully this is a good teaser to what I was talking about, but I just want to sort of, because this was a digital humanities project that I was looking at when I was doing my research on the Sex Series, I really ended up focusing on a very specific question, and that was really a question is, well, have the introductions been getting longer or shorter over the period, and over the period from 1978 to 2018. And so I'm not going to explain the methodology that I was doing, but suffice to say, I ended up scraping a lot of data from this from PennSound, looking specifically at the Sex Series to sort of see whether there has been a kind of what one curator called the introduction creep. And this isn't weighted by any stretch of the imagination, and I wanted to sort of stress that not all of the readings from the Sex Series are currently available because some of them weren't recorded and so forth. But maybe there is something to the fact that, yes, introductions are getting consistently longer. They range from like at first after a minute, at the year in, which so we're looking at in a period of between 1978 to about 1989, 1990, to contemporary times when they're sort of like getting to about 5 minutes long, or so forth. So, you know, maybe they have been getting longer, but the thing that I'm sort of like using this research as a springboard to think, well, are there any sort of racial and gender biases that we can now start to look at introductions? Do men or women offer more framing materials? Do men talk longer? Do women talk longer? Does it depend on who they're introducing, and so forth? And the kind of question that I'm super excited about is, well, what are we supposed to do with this data on PennSound? How are we supposed to curate this information? What kind of tags or meta tags should be included in a place like, in an audio archive that will actually end up helping future researchers to determine their own research projects, and so that they can learn what they need to learn in a database? And what would that really look like in an archive? So I've been talking a lot already, so I'll just sort of pass it over.
Great, thank you very much. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions from you about these great papers we just heard. So if anybody has a question, yeah, Ron.
I was going to say there's an apparatus. Is this thing working? Well, I don't know. I hope so. I want to talk about an intersection of a couple of talks here around the question of how poets from the 60s and from the 50s through the 70s, the New American poets in particular, interact with these kinds of questions, because there was a real fetish when I went to college in the late 60s, and I had Robert Duncan in my classroom, you know, putting notes on the blackboard, driving it into our heads. You know, that the end of the line was, you know, a very important moment in the transcription of speech. And if you listen to the PennSound recording of his reading of all of passages, he counts to 3 at the end of every single line to make sure that it's paused long enough. And I mean, this goes back to Olson's Projectiverse in 1950, which was published in a very non-New American place, the Poetry New York magazine, because there were no projectivist Black Mountain magazines in 1950. And of all the poets that are, say, in the Allen anthology, if they didn't actually practice that, as some of them were very conscious, people like Paul Blackburn, very conscious of practicing that, they at least nodded in that direction, which was sort of Ginsberg's stance during that period. And so Ginsberg's Fall of America, particularly Wichita Vortex Sutra, which is written after the Berkeley Poetry Conference, and I really have to sort of foreground the idea that the big underground text at the Berkeley Poetry Conference was the question of whether or not Ginsberg or Olson was the big papa. Mm-hmm. And Ginsberg had just come back from being thrown out of Czechoslovakia, King of the May. He read Kraj Mahai and Whale's Visitation for the first time. And, you know, was duly royally treated, and so Olson was making the other case against this in Dwinell Hall, a room I believe you know.
Wheeler.
Was that one in Wheeler?
It's in Wheeler.
Yeah, Ginsberg was in Dwinell.
That was the difference.
Yeah. That there's politics there too. But, you know, if you think about how someone like Creeley talks about his shock at hearing Williams read and realizing that Williams doesn't break at the end of every line, which is what his poetics was totally founded on, the assumption that that was the obvious way to read Williams, but it wasn't to Williams. And everybody else was sort of elaborating these theories out of this, with the notable exception, the one person who thought the whole Olsonian projectiverse thing was total bunk was Jack Spicer, who was in fact the professional linguist among that entire crowd. And so something like The Fall of America, where he has used a tape and transcribed from it, really represents this major sort of throwing that old system just out. You know, and Wichita Vortex Sutra in some respects is the most important poem Ginsberg wrote. Maybe not the best, but certainly the one that where he actually shoves things forward in a way that not even Howell can be said to have done. And so anyway, I'm just curious as to how you see those things fitting into, you know, the various critical projects you're involved in.
You want to go first?
I can start this one. I think the question of a break in the Wheeler event of Olson is a perverse question in a lot of ways, because what Olson did was insist on going for over 3 hours without a break. Yes. And that the whole piece, I have a long reading of it in here, is a kind of, I think of it as an abject endurance ritual, in which all of the poets are called to authorize Olson in his continuing to oppress them and continuing to assert his literal centrality in the middle of poetics and with the largest body, and and you know, people kind of trying to get the mic away from him and him not allowing that to happen, and then calling out all his friends in the audience and asking them to say more. And there's one moment when he pauses to wonder whether a reference is to somebody or Anacreon, and says, "Well, I sound so knowledgeable, don't I, Robert? You know, but I really don't know what I'm talking about." And Robert Duncan says, "You're the boss poet, Daddy." And Olson, I think, pretends not to hear him, and so Duncan has to repeat it 3 times. And to me, that's the microcosm of the entire event, right? I'm reading it in relation to Akanchi's piece where he's in the basement, you know, threatening people to come down. He's going to beat them with a crowbar, you know, and that, you know, we call that performance art, and we call Olson's thing bad behavior. But I think actually it was a form of performance art in a certain kind of way, in which it was a kind of kinship ritual for all the New American poets, in which he asserted his physical centrality for 3 hours, you know. So for me, I mean, the question of the line break is interesting, but the larger event is a question of there not being a break. And in fact, when the first person leaves, Olson, well-trained in politics, having worked for the Democratic machine for a long time, says, you know, if you don't understand, buddy, that poetics are politics today, you know, I'm glad you left and you shouldn't have come. And he might have just been bored or annoyed or anything, but he makes this guy's leaving the room an exemplary political betrayal, you know. And so now everybody in the room knows you better not go, or you're going to be in incredible trouble, you know.
So there are a lot of different ways that I think we could sort of think about your question, right? And so one, it's really also a question. So one is that it sort of proves that prescriptions around reading, you know, persist beyond, you know, this period, say, that I'm studying, although they might not be published in elocution manuals at this point, right? They're being disseminated in more samizdat ways or whatever, you know, but basically there are still rules that exist that are thinking about enacting the printed word, right, in, you know, in voice. But really, your question also raises some really interesting questions about the relationship between tape recording. When you use the word fetish, I thought you were going to say fetish around the tape recorder, right? Because there were fetishes around the tape recorder, and people were walking all over the place, like carrying them everywhere and using them in all different ways, right? So it's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of how is tape being used in relation to print and the typewriter, like these different media, and tape was being used for composition. It was being used for study so that we would record readings, and then, well, how long are they pausing after the lines? What does that mean, right? So they're being used in many different and interesting ways. And then how do we, say, compose with the tape recorder back into print, you know, going all the way, you know, then on to Anton, and these are questions that continue, right, in thinking about the relationship between these two things. As far as sort of thinking about the question of studying performance in this archive, there are tools that are being developed and that were being used, right? Tandem straight, there are different kinds of aligners now that are designed specifically to capture and measure pauses, right? So we could actually take a huge data set and then study the length of pauses in different poets and things like that. So that's a DH project that would require a lot of data cleanup probably to work really well, but it could be interesting potentially, you know. Yeah, I guess, yeah, so those are some of the things. And then as far as the length of the reading in general, right, you know, another thing, the archives I've been working with up to now so far have been really from the 60s into the early 70s, right? And the sense is that intros may have been short, but the relationship between actual reading and talking about the poems, right? It's somewhere around 65% if I did my averaging of the archives that I've been working with of talking and not reading, right? So that it really is this kind of, you know, and sometimes the talk is about how the reading is going to go, you know, et cetera. So it's integrated into the performance itself at times. There's this very self-conscious reflection upon what's happening in the event, you know, itself. Anyways, those are some thoughts, you know.
I just want to sort of like, just when you were talking about sort of like measuring the length of the pauses, I mean, I've been using the Sonic Visualizer to measure the length of the pauses in Norbise Phillips' Zong, which has been looking specifically at her Zong 11, which is, we have about like, I think 4 examples in PennSound, ranging from when she first performed that work, I think in what, 2008, up to about more recently. And, you know, I've been sort of looking at how her work's really interesting because that work is getting longer and longer and longer as she's been performing it. But the thing that I'm sort of like more interested in thinking about the performances is like thinking more in the larger context is like, how do we document that in the archive, but also what kind of questions would be more relevant in asking, well, what is the nature of these performance changes, and what can they tell us about the conditions at that particular time, at that particular cultural moment, if that makes sense.
Other questions?
This is great, you guys. Thanks so much. This is a question for Jason. You began when you were sort of running through the 50 years that your book covers, 1890 to, I guess, sort of 1940, at least if we think about the new critics coming in at the end there. You started talking about the Dickens men who got kind of pulled into these minor character mashups. And then we ended with the new critics, right? And this notion of voice as something that inheres in the text rather than in the sort of sonic performance. And it just made me think about novels versus poetry and whether there's a story in your book about how those two different kinds of text, different length of text, different conceptions of voice in these two very different forms of writing are getting, you know, jockeyed, jostled together, or sorted, resorted over the course of those decades. You know, made me think about whether novels have the same kind of a voice coming out of that period, for instance, as poems do, since the poem is sort of, you know, it exemplifies the text, the literary text by the time we hit the new critics. So is there a novel poem thread there?
It's a great question. I mean, so a lot of the early chapters of the book focus on the affordances of the medium in relation to literary genres. So sort of generic affordances and media affordances, and how they sort of clash at times, right? There's really a small number of what we'd call fiction recordings on cylinder or early flat disc, right? And I mentioned there are Dickens recordings of different kinds. The first, and it's a storage, it's a medium storage problem, right, for fiction, right? So the first example of an attempt to extend a narrative over beyond the length of the capacity of a single flat disc from the 19-teens, right? It was Bransby Williams releasing 3 records that represent the arc of A Christmas Carol, right? And so basically 3 encounters with the ghosts, so that was the arc. And then there was another one that went 4, So, but you can literally see the attempt to communicate fiction, bumping up against the medium and then trying to find solutions. And so in a way, the history of the development of fiction on record is in great part about storage capacity. It's the Library of Congress introduction of the Books for the Blind project in the 30s that introduces for the first time a record that a long-playing record, an LP record, right? Even then, you know, I think it was like, I can't remember now, I have it in my book though, like Les Miserables or some super long novel, you know, took up like, you know, some crazy number of discs. Like you couldn't carry it home, right, with you. You know, it was just too heavy and too much, right? I think Matthew Rubery's book, which is a history of the talking book, focuses more on fiction, but he really starts with the Books for the Blind project and moves out beyond it. The way fiction was really remediated in, you know, prior to a larger storage capacity, right, is through one, you know, there are three main ways. One is sort of this characterological method that I sort of played you a little snippet of, like playing a single character. Two was taking scenes from dramatizations of novels, because novels were already being remediated and dramatized, right, in the 19th century. So, and the scene was already a pretty well-established phonographic genre from the very beginning of cylinders and flat discs, right? Sketches and scenes were pretty much the genre of early spoken recordings. So the transformation scene from Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, right, would be an example of an early fictional recording, right? But it's based on the touring play, right? You know, et cetera. The mesmerism scene from Trilby, right? Where you have two characters speaking, but again, it's from Potter's dramatic adaptation of Du Maurier's Trilby, right? So that's the second genre. And then the third is what I mentioned, this attempt to push the medium by having the narrative extend over multiple discs, which didn't happen too much, but there are a few examples, and they're primarily Dickensian, as I mentioned, and A Christmas Carol in particular. Yeah. So that's sort of the early history of fiction on record. Yeah.
Question for Lytle. Oh, I grabbed the mic, sorry. This is going to be a question, Lytle, about the relationship between the kind of work that you and the four at the table and others are doing and the practice of contemporary poetry in particular. I had this idea. So when I first started to talk to Charles Bernstein about recordings, he was obsessed with, and I think he still is obsessed with, but a little less so, the single. That's a phrase he likes to use, the single, which was at the time kind of unheard of because the recordings were generally reading length. And Jason and I have had many long conversations about this because PennSound became committed to the idea of keeping the long recording but then breaking it into singles. And the idea was at the time that the MP3, which is already it's lesser than a wave, it was hard to get that out there. It was very hard for people to download an entire reading, and nobody would. So the single, and I think PennSound contributed to the idea of the poem single, but it's not the only thing, it started to create earworms or earwormism. Like I cannot get out of my head Williams' Between Walls. We have about 15 recordings of Between Walls in the PennSound site, and you just it's there. It's just there. So the people who have this earworm problem, I think the leading sufferers are people like Zach Hardner, who edits the stuff, and like he edits Poem Talk, and he knows this stuff by heart at this point because he has to listen to it 15 times before he gets it right. And then I think the people who were the PennSound staffers who were doing the segmentation from whole to single, they have it in their heads. And then I think next would be students, such as Mustafa's students, who, you know, he's constantly making them listen to this stuff, and then scholars, but then there's the poets, right? Because the best way to discover some poet you're interested in these days is just to pick your favorite search engine and find them, and PennSound will be one of them, and then you're listening again, and you're trying to, okay. It's had an effect on the creation of new poetic work. And the reason I'm asking you is that we were just this morning talking about an instance of Stevens the Snowman, which we don't have a recording of, but everyone has the snowman in your head. And you wrote a kind of homophonic translation of the snowman. The fact of these earworms is actually having a significant effect on new poetry because we're constantly doing homophonic translations of the things that are in our head. That's where the tradition resides. It's what we're hearing. Lytle?
I guess I'd make a distinction between the way one could have Stevens in one's head, which is just about a particular kind of line. I have a metronome with me. And the way that one could have an actual recording of Stevens, had he made the recording of that poem, or the way that for me, if you hear Kerouac actually reading, it has an effect on how you then parse the prose afterwards. And I think one of the paradoxes I was interested in this book is that Charles's early work is about the single in a different kind of way too, which is it's about singularity, right? In the sense that he's very interested in trying to, I think, undo the sense that reading provides the gold standard of interpretability, whereby once the actual poet has produced an authorized recording of his work, you always take that as the truth of the work, right? It's a particular kind of enactment that may not, it may not reflect a text, right? It may not just be a representation of something that we take to be prior, and B, it shouldn't necessarily have an authoritative stance. It's more contingent than other people would take it to be. And so I see a tension between that and a lot of the DH work that's gone on inside analysis of poetry that is predicated on concepts of one equaling one, and measuring applause, measuring gaps, measuring all the kind of DH work that has gone out there, that is going on. While it may be approaching real problems, and I'm sympathetic to those problems, there's some kind of tension between the goal of study of sonic effects as being about potential forms of singularity, and the study of sonic effects as being predicated on a whole mappable set of equivalences that allow us to make meaningful comparisons across huge corpora, huge data sets, So, I mean, I think where I differ from Charles in here is that I'm not interested in that kind of finding the inherent sound inside the poems that he said back in Close Listening long ago, and that kind of singularity is a telos. I'm more interested in, and I think several people have touched on this, the sense of poetry recording, registering all these effects from the outside that are not necessarily associated with intentionality or presence of the poet, but of the actual room that the poet is working in and the social space that the poet is working in. And because one of the kind of classic accounts of poetry effects of poetry recordings is that they separate speaking effects from bodies. And of course they have to do that. Of course it's true that they do that. But the more I listened, the more I was interested in the persistence of bodies and specific kinds of rooms inside the recordings. And in the account that I'm ultimately offering here, it's aligned with a kind of new American poetry recalibration of time, that the insistence on the actual speaking body and the non-semantic sound of the body and the environment is aligned with a kind of attack against the non-sight of media sound and an attempt to ground time and bodies in actual locations. So that's, in a sense, I took singularity and tried to recast it in a slightly more social lens, I suppose. That's where I went with the single.
Well, thanks very much to all of our panelists, to Orchid, to Jason, and to Lytle. And thanks to Zach Gardner and Chris Martin for recording today to add these voices to the archive, which will hopefully sound very strange to listeners in the future. There are books for sale in the back. Thank you for coming and hanging out. Thanks very much. Thanks, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you for putting this together.
Thank you.